Hello, and thanks for tuning in. I'm Jessica Bull, and I write the Miss Austen Investigates murder mystery series, the first of which was published earlier this year.
And I'm Felicity George. I write Regency romances, publishing now from Orion Fiction.
We hope you're enjoying JaneCon as much as we are. It's incredible to be here with a community of fellow Janeites who understand that even though Jane Austen has been gone for over 200 years, she continues to live within each and every one of us.
Jane Austen inspired both of us to follow in her creative footsteps, leading to the joy of living a fulfilling, creative life as authors. For me and Jess, being Janeites also finds our friendship. Interestingly, our decades long love of Jane meant that even before we knew each other, we traveled parallel creative life journeys, reading and rereading Jane's books in the darkest periods of our lives, and also researching her life and times because we just couldn't get enough of her and of the Regency until a desperate need to try our own hand at writing drew us into the same online writing community where we both realized we'd found a kindred spirit.
Jane Austen has been a huge influence on my imagination ever since that fateful day in 1995 when my mum told me there was a new series on TV called Pride and Prejudice and that I might like to watch it with her. I didn't like it, I loved it. The next day, I asked my English teacher all about Jane Austen. He handed me a copy of Northanger Abbey, and that's it, I became a Janeite for life. But it wasn't until 2020 that I realised just how much I needed Jane. When the pandemic hit, I'd just been diagnosed with PTSD. The world shut down, my routines were disrupted, and my wider support networks disappeared overnight. I remember feeling incredibly isolated. To cheer myself up, I started buying more books and listening to more podcasts about Jane. Not just her novels, but also her life. And it was realizing just how hard Jane struggled which inspired me to start writing fiction again, after a hiatus of almost 10 years. If Jane could do it with little hope of being published, moving from home to home, writing in longhand, even sometimes brewing her own ink, then what was my excuse? And it's writing, plus connecting with other Janeites all over the world, that's really helped keep me going over the last few years.
When I was 16 years old, my mom, who was also my high school librarian, handed me a copy of Pride and Prejudice when I was hanging out bored in the library after school, waiting for her to be ready to go home. I opened it up and I couldn't put it down. From the moment Darcy entered the assembly rooms at Meryton, I was hooked. Would Elizabeth marry this tall, dark, handsome, rich man? So proud, so snobby, and so undeniably smoking hot. I became a devoted Janeite from that day. I couldn't have known it as a 16-year-old, as yet relatively untouched by tragedy, but 2 years later, when my father and my brother both died, it would be Jane's books and the film adaptations of her works which I would turn to over and over again for comfort. Jane could conjure a smile, even through the most difficult tears. Fast forward 20 something years, the early days of the pandemic. My husband was working impossible hours at the intensive care unit here in Toronto, which was a COVID hotspot. My kids were struggling with online learning, and I had a herniated disc in my lower back, which left me barely able to move from bed with no possibility of surgery since all but everything that wasn't life threatening was canceled. And well, I needed some joy in my life. After I'd read and reread all of my Jane Austens, I felt um sorry. I felt so much gratitude for the joy that she'd brought me over the years that I decided to finally pursue my lifelong dream of writing a novel. There was no question of when and where I'd set it. I needed to let my imagination dwell in my safe spot, the world of Jane Austen's Regency. And I know that I'm not alone in thanking Miss Austen for being a light in the darkest times of my life.
If you're watching this, we know you'll probably have your own story about the day Jane found her way into your heart, never to leave again. So we're so thrilled to have this opportunity to share why we find Jane's life story so inspiring and to celebrate her remarkable genius with all of you who just get it.
So, what can a country vicar's daughter, dead these 200 years, teach us about living a creative life well? Well, we believe a great deal indeed. Whether you are a writer, a historical costumer, a Regency dancer, a baker, a gardener, a social media influencer, or like us, a most ardent admirer of her work, we can all find much inspiration and hope by following in Jane's creative footsteps.
We're going to share some of our favourite stories about Jane, snippets from her letters, and quotes from her works that have inspired us, in the hopes that they'll inspire you too.
Firstly, we have to ask why Jane? Why are we celebrating her life and work more than any of her contemporaries? It's something that would have seemed unlikely in her lifetime because Jane's journey to publication was not smooth or easy. The odds were heavily stacked against her. Firstly, she was a woman at a time when women's choices were severely curtailed. She wasn't from a particularly well connected family, especially when comparing her to her female author contemporaries like Frances Burney, who mixed in high society as well as in artistic circles and served as lady in waiting to Queen Charlotte, or compared to the prolific writer Maria Edgeworth, whose father was a prominent Irish politician and inventor. It's true that Jane was from the reasonably privileged, middling sort, but she received very little formal education. Although she drafted three of her great novels by the time she was 12, or by the time she was 23, she didn't publish anything until she was 35. Even after she made it into print, her work wasn't as widely read as Edgeworth and Burney, who were two of the most popular female authors of the day and who wrote in a similar style and dealing with similar subject matter. You might say that Jane, Burney, and Edgeworth all wrote in the same genre, so they're excellent examples to use for comparison. During this long journey to publication, Jane also suffered from what we might call depression. She dealt with despair and frustration and self doubt. She also faced ill health throughout her lifetime and tragically died at the height of her literary career at only 41 years of age, having seen only four out of her six complete novels published and leaving two novels unfinished and countless more not even started. Furthermore, after she died, there was no formal drive to preserve her work among scholars, and it was as late as the 1980s before anyone managed to collate and publish her papers, tracking down her missing works and what remained of her letters.
Despite all this, Jane has since become, and I think I can say this here without inviting any argument, the best loved novelist of all time. Once she achieved publication, her fame and her popularity only ever grew. She's as relevant today as she was 200 years ago. She hasn't been out of print since 1832, and she's been translated into over 40 languages across the world. Her stories have even been brought to life in different cultural settings and different eras, demonstrating just how universal and timeless her understanding of human nature is. The continuous stream of film and television adaptations, plus the boom in Austen adjacent literature, proves this interest is not going away. We can never have enough of Jane Austen. Felicity and I believe the answer to why this is lies in her extraordinarily resilience, which absolutely shines through in her work. She's the queen of the happily ever after. As she said herself, my characters shall have, after a little trouble, all that they desire.
I think it was the previous slide that we need to be on, Jess.
There you go. You don't want to miss Darcy and Elizabeth's wedding.
No, not at all.
Her stories give us hope that people can change, that intelligent, lively women will meet partners worthy of them, that snobby fools will be thwarted, and that justice will prevail. More than any other writer, she speaks straight to our hearts. It's as if she sees our struggles, she knows us, and she gives us comfort. Because of this intimate connection, we each have our own version of Jane, our best friend Jane, to inspire us. It's why even Depression Barbie turns to the BBC's Pride and Prejudice in times of distress. And it's from looking at examples of Jane's resilience that we think she can teach us how to live a creative life, especially the way she made use of the opportunities and resources she had. She prioritised her creativity and she continued to write through her troubles.
Jane was born at a time when girls received just enough formal education. Too much, and it was feared that they'd be unfit for their traditional role in society as wives and mothers. Something Austen satirized when she wrote, "A woman, especially if she have the misfortune of knowing anything, should conceal it as well as she can." Next slide, Jess. Yeah. Growing up in rural Hampshire, within an incredibly isolated community, Jane received very little formal education. But she did go away to school. At just 7, she accompanied her sister Cassandra to a small school in Oxford run by a member of their extended family. The reason Mr. and Mrs. Austen gave for sending Jane to school at such a young age was that she would not be without her sister. The Austens joked that if Cassandra were going to have her head cut off, then Jane would go too. Girls' schools didn't have a good reputation at the time. Think of the Lowood School in Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. And Jane's experience demonstrates that they perhaps deserved their poor reputation. After Jane arrived at Oxford, her schoolmistress suddenly decided to move to Southampton, a port town which was rife with infection. Jane, along with Cassandra and their cousin Jane Cooper, all became dangerously ill with typhus. The schoolmistress did not inform the girls' parents and forbade the girls from doing so themselves. Thankfully, Jane's cousin, Jane Cooper, ignored this and managed to get a message home. So Mrs. Austen and her sister, Mrs. Cooper, swooped in to rescue the girls. Young Jane was in danger of her life, which probably contributed to her lifelong health issues. And although Mrs. Austen and Mrs. Cooper managed to nurse all 3 girls back to health, Mrs. Cooper caught the infection and died a few weeks later.
This near miss wasn't the end of Jane's formal schooling. A couple of years later, when she was 9, she and Cassandra were sent to Madame Letourneuil's school in Reading. This establishment wasn't any more academic, but it was more fun, as the girls were left unsupervised for long stretches. And Madame Letournelle, whose real name was Sarah Hackett and who spoke absolutely no French, had a passion for the theatre, which she instilled in her pupils. This must have been the place Jane was thinking of when she later wrote to Cassandra, "I could die of laughter," as they used to say at school. But money was a constant consideration for the Austens. Cassandra and Jane started out as parlour boarders, which meant that, just like Harriet Smith in Emma, they took their meals in the schoolmistress's cosy parlour rather than the dining hall. But financial constraints meant they were later demoted to ordinary boarders, and then in 1786 they were brought home again. And that was it. At just 11 years old, Jane had completed her formal education. But she did not let this deter her from writing. On the contrary, from an incredibly young age, she used her satirical pen to speak out against the challenges that faced her sex by lambasting society expectations of women. We know this because when she was a teenager, her father bought her 3 vellum notebooks, and Jane diligently copied out all her childhood works in her best handwriting, even getting Cassandra to illustrate some of them with watercolours, forming a collection now known as her Juvenilia.
So, in the story Frederick and Elfrida, written when she was 12, this is the bit that I was confusing earlier when I said she'd written her novels at 12. Jane tells the story of Charlotte, a young lady who's courted by 2 gentlemen, because Charlotte must be agreeable at all times, as per society's expectation of women. She's unable to disappoint either of her suitors when they propose, and so she accepts them both and decides that the only reasonable way out of this bind is to drown herself. Her friends have the following epitaph engraved on her stone: "Here lies our friend who, um, who having promised that unto 2 she would be married, threw her sweet body and her lovely face into the stream that runs through Portland Place." So, as you can see, Jane was a satirist from a very early age, and she was encouraged to be.
Because although the Austens weren't especially well connected with fashionable society or the world of publishing, they were incredibly loving and supportive, and they were literary in the sense of being great readers, and some of them even enjoyed writing themselves. Biographers often talk about the men in Jane's family, but her mother, Cassandra Austen, deserves some credit too. Like Jane, she was a precociously intelligent child and was celebrated for what the family called her sprack wit. Her speciality was humorous poems, which she'd use to describe the everyday events of life. Jane's father, the Reverend Mr. George Austen, was a clergyman and a schoolmaster. He owned over 500 books, a remarkable collection for someone in his life circumstances, as books were extremely expensive, and some were rather risque. But Jane's father granted her uncensored access to all of them. Mr. Austen was the first to see the brilliance of her work. He was so confident in First Impressions, an early draft of Pride and Prejudice, that when Jane was only 21, he tried to send the manuscript to publisher Thomas Cadell. Unfortunately, Cadell declined to read it, but what a sweetheart he was for trying. Jane's eldest brother James started his own literary review with younger brother Henry while they were studying at Oxford, and it's thanks to Henry that Jane was ever published at all. He used his army contacts to finally get his younger sister into print. Thus, the first editions of both Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice are, bizarrely, published by Thomas Egerton's Military Library. In later years, Jane paid this family support forward by offering writing advice and encouragement to her nieces and nephews.
The other resource that Jane relied on heavily was libraries. In her day, books were very expensive. As we said before, and to give you some idea, a bound edition might cost the equivalent of £300 in today's money. But she overcame this by being a great supporter of circulating libraries, and she would subscribe to the local library wherever she traveled. Here's a note to her sister, where she talks about a new library opening in Basingstoke. The Mary she refers to here in this letter is Mary Lloyd, her great frenemy. Mary went on to become Jane's sister-in-law when she married Jane's eldest brother, James. To Cassandra Austen, 19th of December, 1798. I have received a very civil note from Mrs. Martin requesting my name as a subscriber to her library, which opens on the 14th of January, and my name, or rather yours, is accordingly given. My mother finds the money. Mary subscribes too, which I am glad of, but hardly expected. And as an inducement to subscribe, Mrs. Martin tells us that her collection is not to consist only of novels, but of every kind of literature, etc., etc. She might have spared this pretension to our family, who are great novel readers and not ashamed of being so. But it was necessary, I suppose, to the self-consequence of half of her subscribers. In Jane's day, the novel was a new art form, and it was dismissed by critics as lightweight and feminine. But Jane had no pretensions about literature. She was simply hungry for stories.
She was also incredibly generous in her praise and esteem for other writers. Her novels and her letters are full of references to contemporary novelists, including Burney, Radcliffe, and Edgeworth. In Northanger Abbey, Jane comes to the defence of her fellow authoresses and gives a famous answer to any critics who might seek to belittle her art form. She calls on her fellow novelists as such. Let us not desert one another. We are an injured body. There seems almost a general wish of decrying the capacity and undervaluing the labour of the novelist, and of slighting the performances which have only genius, wit, and taste to recommend them. Jane may have been geographically and socially isolated, but in her imagination she was connected to a community of writers, especially women.
So, what can we take from this? Well, it is true that Jane was in many respects isolated, lacking connections and formal schooling. But rather than being put off, she overcame this by making the most of the resources and opportunities that she had to hand. Just like one of her heroines, she educated herself, she found the people and the sources that she could trust, and she brought about her own happy ending when she finally saw her work in print. We can't all be blessed by being born into a family like the Austens, but thankfully we do have the world at our fingertips in a way that Jane never did. Social media makes it easy to connect with others who share the same dreams, whether that's writing or costuming or baking or gardening, blogging, etc. That's how Jess and I met, and both of us can say that we would not have got where we are as quickly without each other. So whatever you dream of doing, get out there, get online, and find the people who will support you and who you can support in turn. And if you're ever feeling overawed, remember Jane and tell yourself, my courage always rises at every attempt to intimidate me.
Another enormous struggle facing Jane were the strict limitations society imposed on what women, especially unmarried ladies of the middling sort, could and could not do. For the Georgians, a woman's greatest achievement was to become a wife and mother. Being a spinster was so vilified, People used to say women who deliberately chose not to marry would be condemned to leading apes in hell. On top of this, it was considered immodest for a woman to seek to display her talents in public, and vulgar to have any ambition to earn her own money. But Jane clearly had many talents. She was a phenomenal performer. Her family remember her as being the most accomplished reader of her own work. She played the piano and she composed and arranged her own music. She was interested in fashion, and her sewing and embroidery and skills were much admired. And she clearly appreciated earning her own money. Here's an extract from a letter to her niece, Fanny Knight, where she jokes about this. People are more ready to borrow and praise than to buy, which I cannot wonder at. But though I like praise as well as anybody, I like what Edward calls pewter too. If Jane was around today, she might have been a professional musician, actor, influencer, definitely a prolific tweeter. We'll never know the full extent of what she might have accomplished without such restraints, but thankfully, she found a creative outlet that was available to her. We get the sense that she was able to be herself in her writing in a way that she couldn't in real life. And Jane's real self didn't always accord with what the Georgians or the conservative Victorians who came after her thought was proper. That's why, tragically for us, her family destroyed all but 161 of the 3,000 letters Jane is thought to have written during her lifetime. But writing novels was an accepted, although eccentric, thing for a well bred lady to do. It was something her family encouraged and wider society was prepared to tolerate, as long as she did so discreetly. After she achieved literary success, the Austens were simultaneously proud of her achievements while remaining fiercely protective of her reputation. As the same Fanny Knight recorded in her diary in 1811, another note from Aunt Cassandra to beg we would not mention that Aunt Jane Austen wrote Sense and Sensibility. Sorry, Cassandra, that cat is well and truly out of the bag. But whatever concerns were holding Jane back from attaching her name to the four novels she published during her lifetime, her family, including Cassandra, changed their minds about keeping Jane's identity secret almost as soon as she died. It was Henry and Cassandra who made the decision to publish Persuasion and Northanger Abbey under Jane Austen's name, attached to a brief biography claiming authorship of all of her works to ensure that her great talent would not be forgotten.
Jane clearly understood the way her world worked, and that the easiest and most socially acceptable way for her to achieve financial stability was to marry. As she put it, single women have a dreadful propensity for being poor. But instead of accepting this and conforming to expectations, she made exposing the harsh reality of this dilemma, whether to marry for fortune or remain single and penniless, the beating heart of her work. Again and again in Austen's novels, her heroines refuse a proposal which might have afforded them financial security, but would have meant sacrificing their own happiness. Elizabeth Bennet refuses Mr. Collins in Darcy's disastrous first attempt. Timid Fanny Price's one act of rebellion is to refuse Henry Crawford. And even geriatric Anne Elliot, at the advanced age of 27, refuses Mr. Elliot. By making it clear that a young woman did have a choice in this endeavor and had the right to refuse a financially advantageous proposal, Jane was doing something really quite radical.
And in her personal life, she made an even more radical choice, remaining in what some Georgian women referred to as single blessedness in order to maintain her freedom to write. Jane is sometimes viewed as a kind of sexless maiden aunt, and that's exactly how later generations of Austens wanted her to be remembered. She was lauded as the greatest romance writer of all time, who tragically never inspired love herself. Or perhaps you believe she was an innocent young romantic, left heartbroken forever from her youthful dalliance with Tom Lefroy. But as Jane's niece, Anna, declared, I have no doubt that Aunt Jane was beloved of several in the course of her life, and was herself very capable of loving. The truth is, after Tom Lefroy, Jane went on to enjoy the attentions of many other suitors. We know of at least 5 potential husbands that Jane had to shake off in order to remain single. There's Harris Bigwither, the most awkward anecdote in literary history, whereby Jane initially accepted a proposal from the younger brother of her dear friends, the Big Sisters, while she and Cassandra were on a visit to the family's beautiful country estate in Hampshire, Manydown. Harris was young, 21 to Jane's almost 27, wealthy and perfectly agreeable. By marrying him, Jane would have been elevated in society and secured a magnificent home for herself. But although she initially said yes and even toasted her happiness with Cassandra and his whole family, she got cold feet overnight and had to go through the excruciating agony of retracting her consent and hot footing it out of Hampshire back to Bath in the morning. And it doesn't stop there. She also turned down clergyman Edward Bridges, the brother of Elizabeth Bridges, who married her wealthy brother Edward Austen late at night. Henry's lawyer, William Seymour, once spent an entire carriage ride trying to muster up the nerve to propose to Jane, and since he didn't, we must conclude that she offered him very little encouragement. And James Stanier Clark, the Prince Regent's librarian, was so enchanted with Jane that he painted a beautiful portrait with her after meeting her only once. Men were queuing up to marry Jane Austen, and why not? It's been over 200 years, and we're still all madly in love with her. But Jane bravely declined all of these offers, choosing to remain independent and earn what she could by her pen instead.
So, what can we take away from this? While it would be untrue to say that women all over the world are completely free of the kind of discrimination that severely curtails their options in life, most of us won't face anywhere near the same limitations that Jane did. She was forced to make a very stark choice. Her society did not allow ladies romantic relationships without marriage, and she couldn't have had a marriage without facing the high likelihood of then having the next 20 plus years of her life to be a series of pregnancies and childbirth, nursing, and child rearing. Any woman who married in Jane's time faced grim statistics around death and childbirth, as well as the devastating loss of children and babies. So when we consider what it means to follow in Jane's footsteps by prioritizing her creativity over all else, even romantic relationships and families. Nowadays, we don't need to take it to the same extreme that she had to, but we do still have to make choices regarding balancing a career and having children. And the same is true when it comes to balancing our creative outlets with the demands of our families. What we can learn from Jane is that it's okay to prioritize our creativity. We shouldn't feel guilty or ashamed about taking the time we need to fulfill our creative ambitions. That's a simple but powerful thought. Give yourself permission to prioritize your creativity over what others demand of you.
All this isn't to say that Jane found writing or made the choice to prioritise her work easy. As well as her lifelong struggle with ill health, she had to contend with the inevitable despair and dejection that comes from having your work rejected. And even a literary genius like Jane faced rejection, a great deal of it, much more than Edgeworth or Burney, because she didn't have the connections they had. She was a relative nobody in a society that was even more about who you know than ours is today. Despite this, she continued to write. By the time Jane's father decided to quit her beloved Steventon Rectory, she'd already written the early drafts of Northanger Abbey, Pride and Prejudice, and Sense and Sensibility. She carried those three early manuscripts around with her in her writing box all through the years she was forced to move from home to home, including her time in Bath. She edited her earlier work and started new and then abandoned projects, like the Watsons, which we think became too painful for her to continue after her own father died. Until eventually she found the peace that she needed to prepare them for publication after Edward Austen, late at night, finally gave his mother and sisters a permanent home in Chawton. As Jane put it herself in one of her letters to Cassandra, and this is my favourite quote when I'm feeling dejected: I am not at all in humour for writing. I must write on until I am.
It's a very good quote. And Jane had every reason to feel dejected about her torturous path to publication. She had a false start in her career in 1803 when the publishers Crosby and Co. bought the copyright of Susan, which was an early version of Northanger Abbey, for £10. They advertised the work as soon to be published in a catalogue, but they never printed it. 6 years later, in 1809, Jane's patience had worn thin. In a peak of indignation, she dashed off a letter to her publisher under a rather fitting pseudonym. We'll pop to the letter here. Wait for the pseudonym. Gentlemen, 6 years have passed, and this work, of which I now avow myself the authoress, has never, to the best of my knowledge, appeared in print, though an early publication was stipulated for at the time of sale. I can only account for such an extraordinary circumstance by supposing that the manuscript, by some carelessness, to have been lost, and if that was the case, am willing to supply you with another copy. Should no notice be taken of this, I shall feel myself at liberty to secure the publication of my work by applying elsewhere. I am, gentlemen, etc., etc., mad. Mrs. Ashton Dennis. Infuriatingly, this letter didn't work. Pompous Crosby replied to say that he did still have the manuscript. He was under no obligation to publish it, and that if Jane slash Mad tried selling it to another publisher, he'd sue her. However, she could buy the copyright back for what he paid for it. But it's Jane who had the last laugh. In 1816, after her other works had been published to great acclaim, she did buy that copyright back for the original sum of £10. And it was only after the manuscript was safe in her possession that she let the publisher know that Susan was by the very same authoress as the literary sensations Pride and Prejudice and Sense and Sensibility.
The final struggle, which Jane fought bravely but ultimately couldn't overcome, was chronic illness. In 1816, when she was only 40 years old, she began to experience serious ill health. Biographers have speculated as to the cause, pointing to an immune system deficiency due to the sore throats and eye infections that she regularly suffered. Was it Hodgkin's, Addison's, lupus? We'll never know. But we do know from the tone of her letters that she was determined to overcome this mystery illness. Despite her suffering, she still managed to find joy and maintained her sense of humour. In 1817, she wrote to Governess Anne Sharp, "If I live to be an old woman, I must expect to wish I had died now, blessed in the tenderness of such a family, and before I had survived either them or their affection." But by later that same spring, her health was so bad she was forced to abandon her last work, the fragment we now know as Sanditon, ironically poking fun at hypochondria when she herself was seriously suffering. She moved to Winchester to be closer to medical help, and even on her deathbed she continued to write, perhaps to take her mind off how ill she really was. And she maintained her caustic wit to her final hours. When Cassandra asked her if there was anything she wanted, Jane replied, "Nothing but death." Tragically, she passed away in Cassandra's arms in the early hours of the 18th of July, 1817, aged only 41. It's heartbreaking to realise how young she was when she died, both on a personal level and to think of the many more novels that she showed every sign of planning to write. But even death, in a way, she has surpassed, living on in all our hearts through her work.
We've come to the end of our talk now, and as we said at the start, both of us have found Jane's story incredibly inspiring, especially this last part about how she dealt with rejection, despair, and even her failing health. And we really hope that by sharing these snippets and stories about Jane's life, you'll walk away feeling inspired too. I'm sure that you can agree that the world would have been a much darker place if Jane had let the many struggles she faced overwhelmed her, or if she had given up trying to get her work into print. Jane had a quiet life, but the touch of her quill on parchment set off tremors that became earthquakes, which reverberate 200 years later. So when you're feeling rejected, overwhelmed, and as if no one appreciates your creative pursuits, remember how much courage it must have taken for Jane to continue toiling away for all those years, sitting in the parlor at Chawton, bent over her tiny writing desk, and let her courage inspire you to embrace your creative pursuits no matter the form.
As Elizabeth Bennet found, sometimes it really does pay off to be an obstinate, headstrong girl. Thank you so much for joining us. We've loved being part of Virtual JaneCon again this year. You can follow us on our socials or talk to us using the hashtag VirtualJaneCon. All the details will be under this video. Thanks so much again and enjoy the rest of the programme.
Bye.
How do I can't stop recording. How do I stop recording?
Jess, that was okay, but it wouldn't hurt
Hang
us
on,
to
hang
do it
on, hang on. Thanks, bye.